Hello and welcome to the Flying Frisby podcast, or the Flying Frisby vidcast, I suppose this is, because we're in video. And it's my pleasure to be talking today to a man, I suppose I can call him an old friend. I hope I'm not overstepping the mark. His name is Paul Kingsnorth. He's a fabulous author, the author of maybe 10 or 15 books, one of them in something like original Anglo-Saxon that describes the guerrilla Anglo-Saxon fighters during the Norman conquest. And I may as well plug this now while you're still listening. Paul also runs fantastic courses for writers in the west of Ireland, and you go and spend a weekend in the west of Ireland and Paul goes and makes you do many exercises. And some of you might remember my ode to a compost bin that I perform on stage sometimes, and that was written standing by a compost bin in the back garden of this place while doing one of Paul's courses, and it's become a stalwart of some of my shows. So here we go. Let me introduce you to him. Here he is, Paul Kingsnorth. And Paul, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this podcast. We did a fantastic podcast together maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it got a great response. And why don't we start by, I've described that you're a writer and so on, but the sort of philosophical journey that you've been on, because I think I've sort of gone down the economic route of low taxes and small government to where I am, whereas you've gone down the more sort of environmentalist, localist route, but we've arrived at a similar place. So why don't we start by describing your journey?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Last time we talked, I remember sitting in your front room looking at a map of Anglo-Saxon England and deciding that we wanted to bring back the heptarchy, the original division of Anglo, which I'm still entirely in agreement with. But no, I think we're in some ways closer together than we were then. But I mean, my journey, in short, has been, it's a curious one because I'm 50 years old now, and I started as a kind of writer and activist when I left university. So it's nearly 30 years. I'm feeling very old. In some ways, I'm in a completely different place to where I was, and in other ways, it's exactly the same. And I started my life as an environmental activist and a journalist who wanted to save the world. I was at the same time writing novels and poetry and wondering what the hell the reality of things was, which led me on a kind of spiritual quest, which has taken me to all sorts of places as well. But fundamentally, the worldview I have now is not so different from the one I had when I was 20, which is a worldview that A, sees industrial society as a huge machine that's destroying culture and nature everywhere it goes, and B, thinks that if there's any kind of solution to that, it's a local one. It's effectively almost an anarchist one. Now I've finessed that a lot over the years. I'm much closer to a sort of almost traditionalist position now, I suppose, in the sense that I think you need to have rooted cultures and communities that actually have a sense of place and time to make things work. But broadly speaking, I think that for the last several hundred years or so, this technological society that I've taken to calling the machine has effectively kind of metastasized and taken over human life. It's eating away at the natural world. It's eating away at our cultures. We're now moving into a kind of depressing, boring dystopia that Aldous Huxley would have been proud to have been put on paper. And yeah, my way of seeing that differs from that. My alternative to that is, as I say, not so far away from what it was 25 years ago, which is local power, local community, any way that you can find to kind of escape from the machine. And where I am closer to you as well is my almost complete rejection of the state at this point, which I was always pretty close to anyway, but having gone through the kind of COVID response, the monstrosity of the COVID clampdown, I've become entirely cynical about all power structures, I'm afraid. So so that's where I've ended up.
Well, and you were a left-wing Brexiteer, which was a voice that went completely unarticulated in the political argument, largely because people like Jeremy Corbyn, who should have been articulating that argument, chose not to. But one of the things that frustrates me about not left-wing Brexiteers, but and the reason why you've voted Brexit, and probably the same reason I did, was that fundamental thing that decisions are better made locally. And a diktat that, all farming should be like this set in Brussels might not apply to some quirky little farm in Ireland on a hill, because the fact that it's on a hill and it's got this soil and blah, blah, blah means that diktat from Brussels is just irrelevant and stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I suppose I was a left-wing Brexiteer. I've always been a bit
saying
curious.
Left because of the environmentalist thing.
Yeah. I mean, I would say so. Well, it's always been a frustration to me that people think environmentalism is left-wing. I mean, that's largely because the left has colonized it, but actually the original environmental movement was quite conservative with a small c. And it makes more sense to see environmentalism actually as a branch of traditional conservatism, if you like, because it's about conserving things. It's actually about having a sane relationship with nature, but it's been the activist movement that has colonized environmentalism now is a strange combination of sort of progressive leftism and global capitalism.
Oh, it's awful. Like
it's the worst of both worlds. To be honest.
Horrendous. Like it is
good.
Crony capitalism in its entirety. It's also like all this ESG stuff. You know, I'm always banging on about this. The environmental damage of achieving net zero is just, it requires so much fossil fuel to be burnt and so much, metal to be mined. It's nuts, and it's cronyist, and it's awful. And I'm actually working on an essay at the moment about conflation, how everything is sometimes deliberately, sometimes from stupidity. So, for example, with the Lineker argument, you saw the conflation of illegal migration and refugees and perfectly legal migration. And in the environmental movement, you see the conflation of pollution and conserving nature and environmentalism and all that kind of branch of environmentalism with wind farms, climate change, electric vehicles, and Elon Musk, and they're just not the same thing.
Well, one of the things that's happened with the Green movement, I'm always banging on about this, especially to people on the right, because I hear a lot of people on the right endlessly confusing the kind of so-called mainstream of the Green movement with the problems that it's supposed to tackle. So the fact that what's happened is that the corporate world has mounted a really successful corporate takeover of environmentalism over the last 20 years. It's been incredible. And all of the activists have completely bought into the notion that climate change is the only problem that's really worth focusing on to any extent, and B, that the solution to that is always going to be technological. And what that means is the only guys who can solve the problem are the likes of Elon Musk or any other corporation that happens to be in the game. And so the old Green movement that I used to be part of, which was really about localization and small scale living and small is beautiful and actually reducing the consumption that we are wrecking the place with, and actually trying to live a bit more responsibly. That's kind of gone out the window, and now we've got this global corporate environmentalism, which is also merged with the most self-righteous branch of the progressive left. And so we've got this kind of technological nightmare.
And all this WEF,
self-righteous, it's terrible, yeah.
And all this WEF, smart cities, and you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. It's all part of the same blob.
Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you what's interesting about that is that when I were a young lad, my first book was an anti-globalisation, anti-capitalist, leftish book, an activist book, and I wrote that in 2003. And back then, anyone who'd heard of the WEF who was protesting about it was on the left. And all the people protesting against the G8 and the World Trade Organization and the World Bank and all of these globalist organizations, they were on the left, because that's what you did. You saw these giant, unaccountable business and government bodies, and you said, this is wrong. This is totally anti-democratic and we don't like it, so we're going to take to the barricades. And all the right-wingers were all defending this stuff. Now it's reversed. Everything's reversed. So suddenly the right are now the anti-globalists, and the left thinks that anyone who criticizes the World Economic Forum is a fascist and a conspiracy theorist. And I literally have no idea how this has happened. But again, it's that sort of corporate takeover of the progressive left and of the Greens that I find so depressing. And what that does then is that anyone who is even centrist or conservative-minded then assumes that if they don't like Greta Thunberg, they don't have to care about environmentalism, and then we're all out of the window. So yeah, it's a really topsy-turvy thing that's happened.
It is. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the paradigm of left and right is just so flawed in itself. And, you know, we've talked about it before, the political compass, where rather than left and right, you have you have a scale of libertarian to authoritarian, as well as left and right, and you have a cross. And I think, coming back to that thing, we probably both find ourselves somewhere in the libertarian centre, having been down either side of the quadrant to get there, if you see what I mean.
Well, you know also that the Brexit vote was at least partly driven by this unrepresented constituency of people in Britain, and they're unrepresented elsewhere as well, who are quite economically left, but also quite culturally right, if those terms mean anything at all. So, fairly not particularly traditionalist, but fairly socially conservative in some ways. At least don't want things to change too radically. They value their country and they value their culture and that sort of stuff. But they also want to have a fair country where there's not a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and there's a good health service and people don't sleep on the streets. And that constituency is just not served by any political party in Britain or America, as far as I can see. So you've got this huge gang of people out there who would certainly have fitted into that category of left Brexiteers that you're talking about as well, who just don't have anywhere to go. If you would like to see relatively fair economics but relatively conservative culture, you haven't got anywhere to go. You can either go to the Tories, who want to they're all about the money as far as I can see, and they're not interested in the culture, or you can have the Labour Party, who might nationalise some more stuff, but they'll open the borders at the same time. And there you go. So there's nowhere to go for this large number of people.
There is nowhere to go, and I think the difference between Keir Starmer's Labour Party and the Conservative Party of the last 10 years is so marginal as to be practically indifferent. They're both basically social democrat parties.
Well, you've got these two, as far as I can see, it's almost like the technocrats have got back into control, haven't they? You had a sort of period from 2016 where there was this kind of chaos, and you had Boris Johnson and you had Jeremy Corbyn and you had all this sort of stuff that was happening, bubbling around. And it looked like things might change a bit, which would be shocking. But the technocrats are back. So you've got Rishi Sunak and you've got Keir Starmer, you've got a banker and a lawyer, basically, running the shop again. Everything's fine. The ship is back on course, which is a bit of a tragedy, really, because it's like what happened in 2016 with Brexit was a chance for something to change. A crack was opened, and it just didn't get seized.
Yeah, that's the big disappointment. Now, I want to talk to you about your views of globalisation, because I am slightly I've got mixed views on that, but we're going to come back to that in a second, because I want to come back to your original point about environmentalism and what you were describing in your opening sort of passage, if you like. And it's to sort of describe what is the ideal environment? What is the ideal way for the countryside to look? Now, where I'm going with this is, how much of it should just be left alone and no human dealings whatsoever, and how much should be curated? Who decides who should curate it, and in what way should they curate it? And I'll use an example. Like, people talk about England's green and pleasant land, but for me, when I look at the English countryside, I just think there are too many fields, and they're pretty monocultural. And yeah, the hedges are beautiful, and you sort of take a step back and you look at a view with loads of fields in it, and everyone goes, "Isn't that beautiful?" And I'm like, well, no, it would have been much more beautiful if that was thick woodland or wilderness of some kind. And so, but then at the same time, I can also see, when you go into sort of curated parkland, how beautiful curated parkland can be. And then the most local version of curated parkland is your garden. And gardens are stunning, because they're as local as you can get. And if you've got somebody who likes gardening, managing their garden for them to enjoy and live in, gardens are probably some of the most beautiful places in the country, but they're very curated and man-made. And then you go from there into there's various farms that are being rewilded, a lot of the time bankrolled by the European Union. And I read that book, Rewilding, about that farm in Sussex. And I went to the farm in Sussex and I rather liked it. And I liked seeing the pigs and the bison and all the rest of it walking around. I also saw a mink there, which I was less keen on. But anyway, so do you know where I'm going with this argument? What's the right answer?
Well, if I was designing a utopia, which of course I wouldn't, um, I mean, look, I'd say this. So I've got a few acres of land here in Ireland, the 2.5 acres that we bought with a little house where we live, and we've been here for nearly 10 years. And one of the things we started to do when we came here, although we stopped doing it after a while because we decided to sort of let the land do what it wants to some degree, was apply these permaculture principles, which the Greens have been keen on for a long time. Permaculture was developed in Australia back in the 60s or the 70s, I think, and it's quite a good set of principles for how you manage the land. And effectively, it's kind of a system of rings. So say you had your house at the center, then surrounding your house would be your vegetable garden and your fruit garden. And surrounding that would be your flower garden, your lawn, whatever you had. Surrounding that, maybe a bit further out, you'd have maybe a small woodland, some nut orchards, and then round at the end of the sort of concentric rings, you'd have wild spaces. So you've got a bit of everything, right? So some of the land you're cultivating for yourself, some of it's kind of semi-wild, some of it's wild, you leave it alone or even replant it. We've replanted about an acre of land with native trees over here, for example, because there's very few forests in Ireland. It's the least forested country in Europe. So
is that because the English cut it all down?
Well, it's one of the reasons. Yeah, absolutely, it absolutely is. They cut it down for the warships, but it's not. I mean, the Irish have continued to do it for the last 100 years, unfortunately. So to come back to the point you made earlier about appropriate scale, right? So you'd have to look at the landscape and say what's appropriate for this landscape. Some landscapes are appropriate for sheep farming, others are appropriate for forests, others are appropriate for more intensive crop growing. If you were being intelligent, you would have an ecological farming policy and a landscape policy where you would say, yeah, we need a balance of all these things. So in a country like Britain or Ireland, you need more wild places. That's why rewilding is a good idea. But at the same time, you need to be able to feed yourself so you're not importing the food. If you had government that was, or culture that was locally responsive rather than imposed from the top down, it would be something you'd at least be able to take a stab at. But yeah, the other thing to say is that we're still living the legacy of intensive farming.
Yeah, I mean, if you describe your little rings, which by the way I love, and I'm guessing that the fruit and the veg is closest to the house because that requires the most management.
And also, if you're going to pick some beans and it's raining, you want that to be next to your front door. So exactly that, and you want to be able to watch for pests and that kind of stuff. So the stuff that's furthest away from the house, you pay less attention to, and you have you have spaces that basically belong to other creatures as well. You don't go there very much.
Okay, so if you had a bottom up thing, and 65 million people in the UK, 65 million acres, everyone gets their acre each, and everyone does their little rings on their little thing. I mean, of course that's not going to work. But if everyone who did have some land applied your principles, and then you extrapolate that up, then it works quite well, doesn't it? At a national level.
What you're describing is distributism, right? So I'm sure you know what that is, right? This is Chesterton and Belloc's notion of an equally distributed property that was supposed to be a middle ground between capitalism and communism. And in itself, it was based on Catholic social teaching about how to justly distribute land. So Chesterton particularly was very keen on this idea, which goes right back in English history, that everybody has a right to a piece of land, and that's how you have a decent society where people have a stake in it, literally, because they have a piece of land. Communism attempts to deal with the problem of capitalist concentration of land, but it deals with it by taking all the land into the hands of the state, which makes it even worse. So on the one hand, you've got capitalist concentration. On the other hand, you've got state concentration. And Chesterton's idea is you distribute the land more or less equally to everybody. So it's a bit of a thought experiment. But as a basis for actually living, it's pretty good, because some people would treat that land well and some people wouldn't, and some people would sell it to others and all the rest of it. But broadly speaking, you'd have at least the possibility of doing something radical and appropriate with the place you were actually in. And of course, if land is fairly equally distributed as well, then it's hard for somebody to destroy large amounts of it on their own. So, that's again been a sort of a principle of mine forever, really. If that sort of thing were to happen, which it never will, but if it were, it would be exciting,
No, I mean, my big philosophy, Paul, is it was a line in one of my books, which was find the right answer, realize you'll never see it in your lifetime, and advocate it anyway because it's the right answer. I
don't know if you've read the book The Breakdown of Nations by Leopold Kohr.
No, I know of it.
You'd like this. So this is a book that basically makes exactly the same case on a global scale, that all the nations should be broken up into very small nations, because then it wouldn't even matter how they were governed. It wouldn't matter if they were communist or monarchist or democratic or fascist. They'd be so small that people could control their own rulers and throw them out if they wanted to, and they'd all be very responsive. And it goes through this. It makes a very good case, actually, that the most creative and interesting nations in history have all been small nations, and not big ones. The big ones have all been a disastrous, static mess. The small ones have been creative. And then there's a chapter in the book entitled "Will It Happen?" And it's just a one-word chapter, and it says no. I liked it. It has the virtue of honesty. It was very good. So, but the other thing to say about this is that what we're actually talking about is how a lot of things used to happen before modernity. I mean, this is how rural societies.
Carry on. Sorry, we've got a lag. Carry on.
Sorry, no, I'm just going to say that, you know, we can say that this sounds like a pipe dream, and it sort of does from where we are now. But this is how early modern or medieval England worked before the enclosures. You know, it's how much of the world has always organized itself in terms of small communities, reasonably sustainable farming patterns, traditions that are passed down for managing culture, governing local areas. You know, most places in the world were run like this to some degree anyway. So, you know, it can work, but it can't really work under the kind of all-seeing techno-Sauron eye of industrial modernity.
No, I mean, let me question that point that you've made about, you know, early medieval and dark ages and so on. You know, the life of the serf was not that good. And, you know, the lords were a pretty ruthless bunch, and they enjoyed quite a lot of luxury relative to others in society. So what do you say to that?
Sounds like now, doesn't it? Techno serfs, digital feudalism. Yeah, of course that's true. I mean, it's always good not to romanticize the past. There's never been a perfect system, but just in terms of how villages operated, it's possible to have systems that balance, for example, woodland and pasture and fields and hedgerows and the rest of it. It doesn't mean you have to emulate the political system. We probably don't want feudalism or serfdom or slavery back, but, you know, it's possible to manage the land, I think, in ways much better than we do now. We all know it's possible. But we also all know why it's not happening is because of the interests that are profiting from the system as it works now. And it's also because that we love the cheap food and we love the kind of digital life, you know, so we're all taking part in this.
Yeah, everyone's a hypocrite when they have to pay.
Well, that's usually the way it goes. And we can all come up with good systems, but we'd have to take the hit from things changing. I mean, one of the things I've always thought, which I still think is obvious, is that if we wanted a world that was more humane and cleaner, better for nature and people, we'd have to have less stuff. There's no way you can consume this amount of junk and rubbish and have everything on tap at the push of a button, especially not for 8 billion people, and expect it to work. Because the only way you can make a consumer society work for billions of people is to have this kind of hive mind technotopia in which everything's run by highly efficient machines and we're all sort of cogs in the wheel, which is the direction we're going. And that's the World Economic Forum vision, right? And the reason they have that vision is they want to globalize sort of middle-class capitalist life for everybody. And the only way to do that is through this kind of Huxleyan system of monitoring and control, because there's too many people and they want too much stuff. So that's the paradox. If you want more freedom, I think you have to have less stuff.
Are you familiar with land value tax as a concept?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so this goes all the way back to the physiocrats of I'm going to say the 18th century, possibly, you know, in sort of pre-revolutionary France. And it's all to do with the concept derives from natural law as opposed to positive law. But it was the man who made the idea popular was a 19th century American philosopher called Henry George. And he called it the single tax because this is the only tax you would pay. So there'd be no other taxes, no income tax, no corporate, no VAT, no fuel duty, nothing, just this one tax. And in fact, the game of Monopoly was devised to illustrate the injustices of a monopolistic land system.
It works.
And it illustrates it perfectly. And this book, Progress and Poverty, was a big hit. I think it was like a top 10 book in the late 1900s, just espousing a tax. But the central idea of the tax is that everything that is created by nature should be shared by the community. We'll come to what the community actually is in a moment. But everything that you have created or that has been created by some kind of human endeavor should be yours and yours to keep because you made it. So if you take a plot of land, the land was always there. Nature made it. But the house you build on the land was created by you. Now, if the value of your land, so his idea was that you should be taxed on a portion of you pay a tax each year based on the value of the land, excluding what is on it. Okay. And so, for example, let's say the Irish railway service comes and builds a really busy station at the end of your road. And so suddenly loads of people start using the station at the end of your load and the value of your land dramatically increases. Well, it's not because of anything that Paul Kingsnorth has done that's increased the value of his. I know that would be horrible to you, but let's just assume you were a greedy capitalist. The value of your land would increase dramatically, but not because of anything you've done. It's because of the needs of the community and the investment that's come. And so why should you benefit from the sole increase in the value of that thing? So if you want to carry on using that land exclusively and you want the government to protect your property rights and so on, then you need to pay a rent. He didn't call it a tax, actually. He called it a rent to the community based on the underlying value of that land. And the beauty of this tax is it's transparent and it's immediately felt. And so the only people that would pay it are those that are actually invested in society. And so because they're the landowners. And if the government is doing too much, it's spending too much money on overseas wars or whatever, it's wasting too much money, then your tax goes up immediately and you feel it and you go, no, not paying the tax, or we're voting in a different government. And so immediately it builds a very healthy relationship between landowner and government. The one holds the other to account. And it enables the taxpayer to hold government to account, particularly if it only happens locally and we're living in an Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, or even better, an Anglo-Saxon, I don't know what, 20, whatever 20 is, ventarchy or whatever it is, rather than just 7. But do you see what I mean? And that is the only tax. And the idea is the fundamental idea is that what nature gave us is owned by everyone, and what you made is owned by only you.
So if you don't own any land, you don't pay anything, right?
No.
Okay, yeah. So you could just live in a canal boat.
Potentially.
Yeah, sounds
but
promising.
then you would have to pay mooring and all that based on,
of course,
because somebody's got to maintain the rivers. And if we were to have it now, people go, farm owners hate it when I suggest it because they think they're going to be hit with a huge tax. But the reality is farmland is worth nothing relative to prime city centre real estate. It's not got planning permission. There's not a lot you can do with farmland except grow stuff on it. Whereas, the Duke of Westminster, the Grosvenor Estate or whatever it is, or the Queen, the Crown would pay an enormous amount of land value tax because they're occupying all the best real estate in the country. Well, it's not because of anything the Duke of Westminster's done that the Grosvenor Estate's worth so much. It's because London sprung up all around it, and suddenly the Grosvenor Estate's gone up in value.
Did you ever see that interview with the Duke of Westminster before he died? He was being interviewed by it was very good. It was a few years ago, and he was being interviewed by a young student, I think, for some business paper. And the student said to him, tell me, he said, what advice would you give to young people who want to emulate your success in life? And the Duke of Westminster said, have an ancestor who was friends with William the Conqueror. That summed up British society and politics quite well, I thought. But yeah, a good idea. You can sign me up for that. Yeah.
He also, he obviously had I think the even today, if you have a Norman surname, you're likely to be on average 15% richer than if you have a Saxon surname.
Absolutely, that is true. Yep, and you're likely to own more land as well. And all of the landowners are still descended from the winners of the Battle of Hastings, big ones anyway.
All of them, but a lot of them have now gone because of inheritance tax, and they didn't put the land in trusts and all the rest of it.
Right.
But those that still have are often Norman. But the other thing that massively benefited the Duke of Westminster's estate in particular, and also the Duke of Bedford and the Earl of Cadogan, was the Corn Laws in the 1800s, because they made so much money out of that protectionism, selling their corn at inflated prices, something that globalism would have solved, and we can dovetail into globalism next. But because we would have been able to import corn from America and Russia, but we couldn't. And they built those estates in London with the profits they made on the back of those corn subsidies, basically.
So here's a question then. So if we're looking at England, particularly, Britain as a whole, actually, and Chesterton, again, he said, Britain became a capitalist country because it was already an oligarchic country. In other words, because the land was concentrated in so few hands already, largely due to the Norman conquest, it was much easier for the country to kind of segue into industrialism first, because the same guys could just evict their tenants and enclose the land through parliamentary acts and then funnel the whole thing into a factory system. So do you think that level of land concentration is one of the problems Britain's got? And if it is, what would you do about it? Would you think that tax would sort it out? Because it might not.
Well, there's no way that, like, having just written a book about tax, one of the golden rules about tax is that you can't levy new taxes in times of peace. You have to have a crisis of some kind, and then you get the new tax through on the back of the crisis. So history is littered with people who tried to impose, like Margaret Thatcher's poll tax it was actually not, it was quite a sensible tax, and she was trying to make local government accountable, but the whole thing got turned on its head and she ended up becoming accountable. But she was trying to bring accountability to local government. But that brought her down. And, do you remember like Osborne's pasty tax and the tampon tax? And, and none of them worked. But then, the financial crisis comes along and we have quantitative easing, which is, it's just another form of tax. And if you'd said, we're going to print all this money in peacetime, everyone would have gone, no. But, oh no, crisis, quantitative easing. Similarly, with all the furlough and so on that happened during COVID. So the solution, in my opinion, and the way to equalize land ownership through natural market forces would be this single tax. But it is quite a difficult concept to explain. We talked about conflation earlier. Income and wealth are forever being conflated. They're not the same thing. One often leads to the other. But income tax, we rely, income tax is about 50% of government revenue comes from income tax. The people with the biggest income tend to be workers. They're not always the people with the most wealth. And so, you're often taxing people. That's why it's so hard to progress in this country, because you're taxed heavily on your earnings, which makes it very hard to save up enough money in order to actually buy assets. We don't tax assets. So we tax, the catchphrase is tax land, don't tax labor. But we tax labor, we don't tax capital. So that's fundamental. You design a society by the way you tax it. And if we are to sort of save the world and reform society, then, your patient zero is the system of tax. That's where it starts there. So if we're designing utopia, we get rid of all taxes and just replace it with a simple land value tax. But no government who pledges to do that is ever going to get elected, because the media will just smear him to death. The argument's too hard to explain in sound bites, and the vested interests will make sure you never get your way. It suits the powers that be that people are with on the income is taxed heavily. It suits the wealthy.
Yeah, it's almost as if if you had a party that was called something like, for example, the Labour Party, it would not want to tax Labour, but would like to tax rich landowners instead. Wouldn't that be something?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But
a man can dream.
It's the middle classes who pay the most income tax, and they're just the people that you were talking about with your WEF. So let's move from there, Paul, to globalisation. And
So in that case, so go on. No, go on.
You go. We've got a slight lag, but you go with when I said about the middle class and the WEF. You carry on.
No, I was just going to ask you something about the political system, actually, but we might be able to get there from globalisation. I mean, it seems to me, just again talking about Britain, in some ways in Ireland here, it's even worse, actually. The political system is basically non-existent. In Britain, you've got these two parties that once represented something. There was a party that wanted to conserve things, and there was a party that represented Labour, and then there was another party that was broadly liberal. They don't really mean those things anymore. It's a kind of uni-party of global capitalists on each side to slightly different degrees. Here in Ireland, as I say, it's even worse because the two political parties here stem from the Civil War 100 years ago. So they're the two factions of the Civil War that were fighting each other over the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And now they're even more of a uni party than they are in Britain, and they're actually both in government together at the moment with the Greens. Having spent 70 years attacking each other as evil incarnate, they're governing absolutely fine together. They've got a rotating prime minister. They're both doing exactly what the EU tells them and what Silicon Valley tells them. And the media if you think the British media is bad, the Irish media doesn't have a dissenting voice to be seen. It's quite astonishing, actually. I mean, it's a much smaller country, so there is that, but there's an absolute monoculture, and the same is true in Britain. And what we also saw during Brexit, even with the Brexit Party popping up and with UKIP popping up, is that even if you start a new party that's popular, you can't break into the system. And that's been a perennial problem. I mean, I think it was the 2015 election or something, the UKIP got 5 million votes, didn't they? And they got one seat. And the Scottish National Party got 1 million votes and 52 seats. It was astonishing. But I mean, you have this radical new party that's, whatever you think of them, they get 5 million votes and no representation at all. It's just an insane system. And
it's almost 10% of the vote.
Yeah, and it's quite something. But
I'm a big.
I don't know what to do about it, but it's a perennial problem.
It is a perennial problem, and it is as though the system is designed to protect the system.
Yes, imagine that.
And it's in with your theory of the machine. Yeah. And you can't change it. And it's the same in Ireland. And, some people think that's its virtue because it stops revolution being possible. And at least in America, if you want to have if we wanted to have a revolution in, 1342 or something, or what was it, 1382, peasants could all grab their sticks and march off to fight the powers that be. And the difference between armaments between the peasants and the sticks and the soldiers with their swords is not that great. But now soldiers have got guns and tanks and ordinary citizens have got nothing. We haven't even got sticks. So the only way we have to rise up and revolt is through the ballot box. And the ballot box is designed to stop any change happening. The two-party system entrenches it. So change is impossible politically. And the one way, funnily enough, where we got some change was the European elections every 4 years because they were PR. And so the Brexit Party, or Farage, UKIP, got a voice, was successful, and they were able to lobby the Tories into doing stuff. But now we've lost the European elections every 4 years, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever. So I'm a big direct democracy guy. So I'm a big, it's so obvious to me. Should marijuana be legalized? We'll have a vote, get your phone out, have yes or no, have a vote, and then the politician becomes the administrator of that vote. Something similar to that happens in Switzerland. What's the ideal number of immigrants to have come into the country every year? That's a question that's not even discussed. What is the ideal number? Is it 500,000, or is it 50,000, or is it net zero? What is it? So, and then you just have a vote, and then you get your answer. That's what the people want, and it's the role of the politician to administer it. Never going to happen. But if we're designing utopia, in Dominic Frisby's utopia, you have land value tax, direct democracy, and there's a case, by the way, that you only get to vote if you pay tax, which is another thing in itself, because that stops the people, the great George Bernard Shaw quote, a government promising to rob Peter to pay Paul can count on the support of Paul. So you've got that. And then the third thing we have is sound money. And, a government can't print money. And that's then everything else, you just get on with it and do whatever you want.
So if I'm adding to your utopian mix, I would have to add radical localization to that mix. Because for a start, I don't think direct democracy works without radical localization. So say that you could, scale is everything. I mean, this is one of the things I've perpetually banged on about for 20 years. I mean, so say to take that point you made about immigration, how many people do we want coming in from elsewhere? Well, London might want a lot more people than Cornwall, right?
Yeah.
A small town might want far fewer people than a big city, or a town with a big hospital or university in it might want lots of skilled immigration, and another place might not want any. People might have different cultural opinions. At the moment, what happens is that whatever the British state based in London wants, the rest of the country has to suck up, whether it's about immigration or anything else, and that's true of everywhere. If you had radical localization, right, proper direct democracy, say you've broken your country up into tiny little cantons, or just go back to the county system in England. We've got counties. Yep. So what if every county had actual power? What if every county could decide what its house building policy was, and what if every county could decide how it ran its health service? Again, it's pie in the sky stuff, but that's how things would be accountable. And then what you get as well, interestingly, is you get real diversity, because we hear a lot of talk about diversity, and it's usually just sort of skin deep propaganda stuff. But actual diversity would mean that different places would be different. And say you've got Bradford, where there's a large Muslim community, right? If you had direct democracy there, you get a very different result to what you get in the Cotswolds. You'd have a different culture. You'd have different things happening. People might not like this in different parts of the country, but that's what actual democracy would look like. Different places would genuinely be different to each other.
Well, I agree with 100%, Paul, and I'll add radical localization to the manifesto.
Brilliant. Okay, you're designing a political party here. You know that, don't you?
And let me add to your thing about diversity. I did a lecture at the Edinburgh Festival last year, all about the history of weights and measures. And one of the reasons, like the technocrats throughout all of history have been trying to standardize weights and measures. And we used to design weights and measures around the human body. But all people around the world aren't this. So just because we didn't have weights and measures on our person, the easiest thing to use to measure something out would be, your hand to measure the height of an animal, or your foot to measure a distance, or a stride to measure a distance, or your thumb pushed down to measure an inch. But not everyone. And surprisingly, these parts of the human body are surprisingly consistent. But what you had in pre-revolutionary, the metric system instead goes, we're not designing something around the human body. We're going to design something around the Earth itself. And so the metric system was the distance from the North Pole to the equator, and then divided by 1,000,000. And that's how you'd get a meter. But the guys who measured it cocked up the measurements. So and then they fudged the data. And so the measurement's actually inaccurate. But anyway, that's one of the reasons why architecturally we have so little diversity today, is because everyone uses the same system of measurement. Whereas, for example, in pre-revolutionary France, every town had its own slightly different system of weights and measures. They used it because they were corrupt, and they were using it to fudge taxes. So a pint in one town would be different to a pint in another town, and so on. But it also meant that because an inch in one town, or a foot in one town, or a yard in one town was slightly different to somewhere else, and slightly different systems of measurement sprung up wherever you were, that's why there was so much colour and diversity in architecture around the world.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And of course, you've got the vernacular materials as well to bring back the ecology back into the discussion, right? True environmentalism. Different houses are made of different things depending on what materials are locally available. So you get
absolutely
you get your thatched cottages and your Cotswold stone and your North of England stone, and everywhere again looks different. One of the things I wrote about in my book, Real England,
unlike concrete.
Yeah, bloody well. I mean, this is the thing. Here's talking of France, when they had the revolution in France. One of the wacky schemes that they had, because the French Revolution was the first modern revolution, which means it was the first rationalist revolution. And the Bolsheviks took it even further in 1917. But the whole process of modernity, and this is a thing that the socialist left and the progressive left have always been very, very big on, is a process of rationalizing the world. It's about taking things away from the human scale and the vernacular and trying to create this giant rationalist utopia where everything's measured and everything's accountable and everything's the same and everybody's equal. So what they did in revolutionary France, they dropped this scheme after about 3 weeks because it was so insane. But they tried to break the entire country up into squares of land that were exactly the same in terms of in terms of their measurements. And I think it was something like 100 meters square. The whole thing was going to be divided up into squares and then distributed according to whatever scheme they'd come up with. And it was too bonkers even for them, and they couldn't make it work. But it's part of the same mentality that as you say, replaces the weights and measures with something standardized. When I wrote my book Real England, which is a kind of pie to sort of dying, irrational, awkward, vernacular England, my favorite chapter was the one on pubs, for obvious reasons. But it used to be the case not so long ago that and it still is the case to some degree now. There's been a bit of a resurgence. It's a good news story, but there would have been a different brewery in every town and a different beer in every town, and that beer would taste different because the water was different. Mm-hmm. And the hops would grow differently in different soil, and so the beer would taste different. So you had this incredible diversity of craft beer, which, as I say, has come back. So there's a success story.
Yeah,
but that's all about things tasting differently because they're in different places, and that's true of human culture as well. And that's exactly the thing that globalisation, which is part of this rationalist modern scheme, exists to eliminate, because it's irrational, it's awkward, it can't be measured, it can't be taxed, it can't be controlled, it can't be centralized. And so, the machine, if you like, does not like it.
The other thing you had, which I think is a great shame that's gone, is diversity of accent. So, before mass media, I gather that every village, 20 miles up the road, 10 miles up the road, even in Oxfordshire, people had different accents. And I remember when I was a little boy, I always listen out for accents, and I could tell which part of London somebody was from by their accent. I don't think I could do that now. Now we've just got this homogenized, well, there's sort of two types of accent now in London. There's the sort of homogenized estuary blob, and then there's that sort of Jafaican Cockney hybrid, which is, I occasionally catch my children speaking, and Christ, they get a bollocking because it just is the ugliest accent I've ever heard. But it's sort of monocultural, the accent.
Well, everything becomes monocultural, and the other thing to talk about, since we're designing our utopia, is the impact of technology. Because the fact that everybody has a smartphone in their pocket, and everybody is on YouTube, and everybody's on Instagram and TikTok and whatever it is, means that your local culture, even if you were trying to protect it and keep it strong and nourish it and the rest of it, is just going to be overwhelmed by this tidal wave of stuff that's broadly very globalist and very American. One of the things I've noticed in Ireland is a lot of the younger children sound American. They've got American accents now. They don't have Irish accents because they're spending all their time on the internet, and it's really just very depressing to see it.
Now let me argue with there a second with you there, because this takes us into the conversation about globalization. So, by the way, the reason the Irish accent and the American accent sound similar, I mean, it's a much shorter step from the Irish accent to the American accent than it is from the English accent to the American.
That is true. That is true. Yeah.
But, and it's all to do with the Irish population of America, whatever, and the West Country, what is called the reticulated R that is used in the West Country and in Ireland that you wouldn't find in England, in London, I mean. And so the Australian accent is more like the East of England accent, the London accent, the Cockney accent, even the Dutch accent to an extent. And the American accent is more like the West Country and the Irish accent. But even so, I take your point, but the beauty of the internet, I'm going to speak up in defense of it, as well as the homogenization of everything, it has also catered to niche interests in a way that, mainstream media never could. So, for example, there'll be some guy who maybe has a little fishing show or something, and he's got some technique of fishing that is really interesting to certain types of fishermen. And he'll put his little video up about fishing, and anyone who's interested in this particular type of fishing from around the world will congregate and watch this video, and they'll argue about it and they'll discuss it. And similarly, there's all sorts of weird little niche things. And then when I watch a little video and maybe it's a Japanese guy and he's walking through a Japanese village and he's talking about something really specifically Japanese. I really like that video because it's, this is Japanese and I didn't know about that. Rather, whereas if it's just some bland, hip hoppy house in California or something with a load of naff modern Italian furniture in it, it's of no interest to me. And so that kind of, I mean, it might be of interest to some people, but I do think the internet, as well as blandifying everything and homogenizing everything, it's also catered for a lot of niche interests and enabled niche cultures to evolve.
That is true. That is true. And, my writing is one of those niche interests because I'm writing on the internet at the moment, and people can pay for it and I can make a living out of it. So, yeah, that's obviously true. You're quite right there. And, anytime I need to do something in my house or on my land that I don't know how to do, I can usually find a video on YouTube that will show me how to do it, right? So that's true. But the paradox is that both of these things are true. So the internet is homogenizing the world and enabling the acceleration of this globalized machine culture and this culture of control. And at the same time is creating a kind of ecosystem where people who don't like that culture of control can find other people to talk to. But then the paradox is that a price worth paying? So say you can watch videos of guys walking around in Japan, but the very fact that they're on the internet and we're on the internet is homogenizing all of our cultures, so they're becoming less distinctive and more like each other. Again, it's a theoretical question because it's not as if there's a big red button to turn it off. But if there was a big red button to turn it off, would you press the button?
I don't think I would. Because I think if it's destroying us, but it's also what's going to save us. You talk to Farage. I worked for GB News for a little bit, so I got quite matey with Farage. And he used to say, the internet made me. I would never have been, my movement would never have been anything without the internet. It's because those speeches I made in the European Parliament went viral. And then I'd be invited on whatever it was, Question Time, and then people would watch it on the internet. So this whole kind of counter-cultural, counter-technocracy, counter the machine, anti this, anti that, this whole anti-movement, which it might just be my little bubble on the internet, but I think it's more powerful than the mainstream now, has been enabled by the internet. So I don't think I would switch it off.
I think one thing the internet has done that's useful is basically destroyed or damaged the corporate media in a very useful way. So that, as you say, you can find sources of information, whatever you want to find. But at the same time,
it's created a new corporate media.
It has. Well, I mean, it's done that as well. It will always do that because everything will end up concentrating. But I mean, here's the thing the internet also does, of course, is it creates addiction in everybody who's got a smartphone, especially in children. And
that is bad.
It's rapidly pushing AI culture, which is going to destroy God knows how many jobs and how many cultures. And of course, it also enables the kind of the machinery of control which is building up around us. If we didn't have smartphones, we could not have had digital passports during COVID, and then we could not have been shut out of society as we were here in Ireland if we hadn't taken a vaccine. For example, I couldn't go to the pub for 6 months because of my medical choice. And it's of course it's the internet that enables the social credit system in China as well, for example.
Yeah, and that is bad. And bias in AI is a massive problem, and also consensus in AI is a massive problem. And the way that, now it's all coming out with the Twitter files and so on, the way that the internet was manipulated, Twitter, YouTube, whatever, were manipulated anti-Trump, and then the COVID narratives, the way, and they were false, they were wrong. So that is bad. Let's go from here, Paul. I want to talk about globalisation, which is a word that's come up several times. And you've basically argued that it is not a good thing. It's obviously, and I'm sure you'd admit this, a bit more nuanced than that. Because while on the one hand, globalisation leads to the homogenization and the concretization and the blandification of everything, on the other hand, I like the fact that I'm able to buy stuff from anywhere. And I like the fact that I'm able to sell my product to anywhere. And, you know, in our Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, I'd like to think that there's free trade between counties and free trade between the county of Wiltshire and you know, Wiltshire County, US, and Wiltshire, wherever Wiltshire, there must be a Wiltshire in Australia, maybe there isn't, but you know, let's say take the word Plymouth. There's a Plymouth in Australia. I think there's a Plymouth in New Zealand, and there's a Plymouth in the UK, and there's a Plymouth in America. I would like there to be free trade between all the Plymouths, and indeed between places that aren't called Plymouth. So I kind of think there are good things to globalization. I like the fact that somebody is able to go anywhere in the world. So let's talk about maybe some of the merits of globalization as well as the evils of it.
Yeah, well, you're not going to reverse it, are you? And it's not a new thing. Again, coming back to Ireland, I mean, there have been people coming here on boats for 10,000 years, right? I mean, it's an interesting bit of genetic research I read, which suggested that 85% of the men in Ireland are descended from Anatolian farmers from what is now Turkey, right? Because they came, this is an alternative, the genetics seems to be disproving some of the theories about how the Irish are mostly Celts from Central Europe, whatever that quite means, because we're not quite sure who the Celts are anyway. A lot of them have come from the Middle East, up through the Mediterranean on boats, a long time ago, very long time ago. And
I think a lot of the time you could walk it.
Well, certainly before the ice age, but even after that, the sea lanes were much easier to navigate than the land. And you know, we know that people have been trading worldwide for tens of thousands of years. You can find beads from all over the world in European graves from 30,000 years ago. So in that sense, that's
and the Irish go the other way as well. There's no country in the world that.
Oh, the Irish go everywhere, yeah, and the British go everywhere too. So I mean, this is, you know, look, I mean, people have been moving forever. And people have been trading forever, and people have been exploring and crossing borders forever. So that's not going anywhere. The difference today, of course, is that technology allows everything to go hyper-globalized extremely fast. So you've got record levels of population movement and migration. People can get on a plane and go to the other side of the world in 24 hours. We can trade everything with everywhere. So in a sense, you know, you're not doing anything about that until the system collapses, which it probably will. Then it's not going to contract. My reading of human history is that you just get these expansions of kind of machine societies, of empires, of technologically sophisticated civilizations, and then they overreach themselves and they collapse due to social or cultural or ecological problems, or all three, and then you get a retribalization, and then the whole process starts again. And I think what we're in now is the kind of the peak, or maybe the beginning of a trough of the kind of the globalized modern empire. And who knows where it's going to go. But the thing about the stuff that you're talking about is you can have all these things. You just have to be prepared for the price that you're going to have to pay. I mean, there's a new book out, which I haven't read yet, but I've just taken delivery of. It's called Cobalt Red, and it's all about cobalt mining in Africa, where all the cobalt that is in everybody's smartphones comes from, which is basically modern slavery, right? All these young African kids, absolutely horrific conditions that these children basically are mining poisonous cobalt in.
So there was a video of a landslide in a cobalt mine that did the rounds on the internet a few days ago.
This is the thing. So we're having all these conversations about how slavery in the British Empire was awful 200 years ago, which it was. But the slavery is still going on, so that we can have the smartphones that we tweet on, and that's, you know, that. So that's, you know, I'm here on my computer, so I'm not pointing fingers at everybody else.
Yeah, it's shut out of view.
That's the price you pay, right? That's the price you pay. So you can have the nice stuff, but you also have to have all the factories in China with the suicide nets outside the window and the cobalt mines and all the rest of it. So it's same as it's ever been. You know, there's a price for the luxury.
And our price is £1,000 for a phone.
Yeah, well, yes,
really, you know,
but they don't tell you where it comes from. Yeah,
I mean, it's out of sight, out of mind. Paul, we've talked for an hour, and my experience with these interviews is that I don't have Joe Rogan's allure, and I can't talk for 3 hours and keep the audience going. After about an hour, people go, right, we're going to do something else. So I love speaking to you, and I'm going to recommend everyone watching that they subscribe to your Substack, which is?
It's called The Abbey of Misrule. It's just paulkingsnorth.substack.com, I think.
Okay, and I found I'm always reluctant to upgrade. I'm a bit tight because I've subscribed to so many things, but I've recently upgraded. Your last essay was so engaging, and you put that barrier right in the middle, and you caught me, and I was like, "Rah, I'm gonna have to upgrade." But
that was a shocking piece of capitalism from me. I apologize. Apologize for that.
But I'm so I suppose if there's one thing you should do, subscribe to Paul's Substack, and from there, you can find out about his courses and so on. But I cannot, having done it myself, I cannot recommend his writing course in the west of Ireland enough. You are still doing that. Are you still doing that?
Well, I haven't been doing it for a while, but I might start doing it again. I stopped doing it over COVID, so we'll see. But it's been really enjoyable. I'd completely forgotten that compost heap poem was composed there, so I'm excited that that's being performed in London.
But I want, before we close, Paul, I just so I plugged your letter and so on, but I want to ask you about the future. Where do you think this is going? And we've obviously talked for an hour of ideally where it's going, but where do you think it's actually going?
Yeah, well, so hang on. Before I answer you, I'm going to remove this noisy chicken that you may be able to hear in the corner of my room. Give me 1 second.
Shouldn't it be roosting?
It should be. It is roosting, but it's being very noisy.
I love chickens. Do you not have foxes where you are?
This is the culprit. This is the bantam that lives in the corner of our room because it's too cold to go outside. It's a Malaysian bantam, and you're supposed to be asleep, but you've been being very noisy. Sorry about this.
And does it not poo everywhere?
Well, it's in a cage. This is my daughter is a chicken keeper, and she bought these 3 Malaysian bantams, but we didn't realize they couldn't live outside with the other chickens, so they now live in a cage in the corner of our dining room. And
do you let them out in the day? Do you?
Sometimes they come out on the day, but they quite enjoy their cage as well. This chicken has never been on the internet before, so it's there you go. Well done, you're a star. Now go back in and be quiet.
Chickens are funny. They don't mind cages as long as they don't know any better. It's when they get used to the big wide world. They kind of feel safe in the enclosure of a cage.
They don't mind their domestication, but where do I think it's going?
Do you not have foxes?
We do have foxes.
Do you keep them all in the run?
And we've had a fox attack, and we've had a pine marten attack as well. Yeah, we lock them up at night, otherwise they get into trouble.
But do you let them out during the day?
They run around in the day and they jump into their own cages at night, and then we lock them in. Yeah.
And the foxes don't get them in the day?
No. Well, they have. We had a fox attack one afternoon, but mostly the foxes don't come out till the evening.
Okay. In London now, you see them walking along the street in the middle of the day. It's nuts.
I think the urban foxes are much more hardcore than the country foxes out here. They're quite careful. But in London they're very bold.
Urban everything.
yeah. That's the future is urban foxes. I think the future I can see at the moment is it's based on what we've been saying. There's almost 3 things you can see. There's on the one hand, there's a kind of breakdown going on. I think ecologically there's a breakdown. Socially, in some places there's a breakdown. I think economically things will probably break down in a lot of countries as well. I just don't think we can sustain the course that we're on ecologically and economically. At the same time, you've got a kind of massive technological centralization, which is leading us into this kind of future of artificial intelligence and monitoring of the population and control from the top. So it's a kind of combination of breakdown and clampdown, if you like. Almost like a Chinese style future, I think, is potentially what we're walking into. But then the third, cheerier aspect of it is the thing we were talking about just now, which is all of the communities online and in the real world, which are kind of already curating a different way of seeing and starting to almost opt out of that already. That's what the last essay you were talking about that I wrote about was about. How do you actually opt out of that system of control and centralization if you want to? That's what alternative media sources are doing, and that's what online communities are doing, and that's what real world communities are doing. And I think it's probably going to accelerate. So it's not going to be calm, is it? The next few decades, it's going to kick off in a lot of places, and you never know quite where it's going to go. But those are the kind of the 3 aspects that I probably see happening.
You know, the nation state as we now know it is a relatively recent construct. It's only about 200 years old.
Yeah.
Do you think the nation state will still be a thing in 50 or 100 years?
Well, the thing about the nation state, as you said, is that it's a power center that sustains itself. It's a system that keeps itself going. I mean, the way I always look at Britain, for example, is that it's still basically an empire. I think London and the financial center of London, especially, and the landowning classes of Britain have been running an empire for centuries. And they went out into the world and, well, the first thing they did was they colonized all the ordinary folk of Britain by enclosing their land and forcing them into the factory system. Then they went out and colonized people across the rest of the world. Then eventually they got booted out of the rest of the world. So they're just back running Britain as a kind of mini financial colony now. And it's a self-sustaining situation. So every state, you know this, every state will sustain its own power as long as it can.
Yeah.
But then having said that, nation states come and go. They don't last. And you know, there's every possibility that they'll break up into smaller units. That seems to happen quite a lot.
It does. It's all to do with tax. As soon as they lose their tax revenue, they lose their power.
It's also legitimacy. I mean, that's the other thing I was writing about in that recent essay of mine. I feel like in the last few years, the last 10 years maybe, the state, the government, the authorities as a whole have just lost a lot of legitimacy with people.
They have.
A lot of ordinary folk, you know, not political radicals, but everything from the Iraq war to COVID to Brexit to Donald Trump to whatever it was. And just the insane and obvious lies of the corporate media at this point. It's very difficult to trust those in authority. And once that sort of level of trust has gone, once there's not much authority left, then you know, anything can happen. Actually, it's not necessarily a good thing that could happen, but anything could happen in terms of just people almost refusing the will of the state. They're doing it in France right now, so you know, you never know.
Yeah, good luck to him. Paul, thank you very much once again. paulkingsnorth.substack.com, and let's do another one in a few months and review where we are. Yeah,
we could do it in 6 months and review the predictions. How about that?
There we go.
Good to talk to you, Dominic.
You too. And to you at home, thank you very much for watching, or maybe you're not at home, maybe you're in the car and you're listening in the car, or you're watching on your phone, whatever. But thank you very much. And please subscribe to my Substack, theflyingfrisbee.com, where you're watching this video, or you might be watching it on YouTube, but you watched it first on the Flying Frisbee. And I'll be back with another video very soon. Goodbye.